Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone here on this chilly Michigan evening. It's a great night to be out. It's a great night to have a conversation about what's going on in our country and beyond. And it's exciting for us here at Temple Bethel to welcome you to what has become a couple times a year where we are lucky enough to bring in a world-class speaker and thinker who is going to be sharing with us some thoughts about the world. We all live in this increasingly small world, and sometimes it's important for us to have people who can help guide us through it, but we're going to not trust those guides too much. He's going to tell you why in a few minutes. But it is my pleasure right now, first of all, to introduce Aaron David Miller, who is currently the Vice President for New Initiatives and a Distinguished Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. For 2 decades, he served in the Department of State as an analyst, negotiator, and advisor on Middle Eastern issues to Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State. Between 2003 and 2006, he also served as president of Seeds of Peace, an internationally recognized program in conflict resolution and coexistence. Aaron has written 5 books, including his most recent, The End of Greatness: Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Should I keep going?
Yeah. Absolutely.
His articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and his column Reality Check appears in Foreign Policy magazine. He is a CNN Global Affairs analyst and a frequent commentator on NPR, BBC, and Sirius XM Radio. Please help me welcome Aaron David Miller. Just before we continue, I want to quickly mention that we are very lucky here at the Temple to have a strong partnership with the local JCRC and AJC, and it's a pleasure to have their president, Alicia Chandler, with us, as well as David Kurzman, who runs the organization. Again, an incredible organization doing great work on all of our behalf in this community, so thank you to you two for being part of this program. I also just quickly want to recognize Cantor Komowitz, Rabbi Brudney, and where did he go? Rabbi Syme, who are all here, as well as a lot of other staff and board members from the Temple. Again, thank you everyone for being here this evening. So just by way of beginning, Aaron actually has strong ties to this area. He grew up in Ohio, but went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He grew up with 2 of our Temple past presidents, Jim Deutschman, who's here this evening, and David Handelman in Cleveland. There's at least one applaud there. And when we were talking this week, a couple days ago, you said to me that you are an analyst, not an advocate. An analyst, not an advocate, which I took to mean that we are certainly going to be discussing politics this evening, someone who has worked so closely in the government, but it's going to be from an analyst position, not necessarily taking sides or taking a pro or negative against one or the other.
Yeah,
but we're going to be analyzing events.
That's fair to say. I mean, but my analysis is a result of 25 years of trying to test propositions and assumptions against the backdrop of trying to make the world the way we wanted it to be as opposed to the way the world really is. So yes, I would say I'm an advocate for, and I have very strong views, I'm an advocate of a sober, realistic view of the world that maintains hope, but without illusion. Jack Kennedy was the first and last president that had an emotional impact on me. I was 12 when he was assassinated. I used to ask my mother, who the only president she knew was FDR, where she was when she heard FDR had died of cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs. And she couldn't recall. She was fairly young at the time when I asked her the question. I don't know if any of you who were there during those years could remember where you were. I mean, Roosevelt was the only president my mother knew, which is an extraordinary, stunning fact about American politics. I remember where I was when Jack Kennedy was assassinated, and I'll never forget it. I only raised Jack Kennedy because my own view of the world, and it's important that you understand. Rabbi Miller talked about whether or not you should trust your guides. I'm your guide tonight for a brief period of time. The answer is, I think the views I have are worth hearing. The ones you like, you should keep. The ones that you are not sure about, you can noodle about afterwards. And the ones you reject, we can argue about. My point is that you are the ones who need to do the testing and the searching. I mentioned at dinner that we live in a culture now where people don't reach, they don't stretch. They maintain themselves within the comfort and refuge of their own bubbles. And we live at a time where with a click of a mouse, you have the capacity to access more information, more diverse points of view, more different perspectives to weigh than ever before. And yet we don't do it. We're more polarized, more partisan, more comfortable in our bubbles than ever before. I think that's one of the problems that challenges the nation. I talked earlier about a speech Jack Kennedy gave on October 22nd, 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most serious foreign policy crisis we faced until October 62, and the most serious foreign policy crisis we have yet faced. And Jack Kennedy spoke for an hour. There were 3 networks then. You know that when Kennedy finished his speech, I didn't listen to it, I'm sure my parents did. The networks, there were only 3 of them, went back to normal programming. Think about it. Today, in the lead up to a president's speech, you'll have a digital clock which ticks off the time until the address. You'll have banks of journalists. The network that I work for, part-time, will have 8 or 9 journalists with laptops in tears telling you before the speech what the president should, must, and might say, and afterwards. If you're lucky, there'll be no commentary during the president's remarks. But afterwards, you will hear analysis about what it all meant. And that night on October 22nd, 1962, my parents had to listen to Jack Kennedy talk and weigh for themselves his words and what he was proposing. And my, I guess, unsolicited piece of advice, I'm not here to lecture you or to moralize, is that it's critically important to search and to reach your own conclusions. And that's, I think, the essence of my journey over the course of the last 25 years. We're going to talk a lot about the Middle East because I know that's an area of interest, but I want to make 3 points about what I've learned as a consequence of traveling the negotiator's highway. Number 1, the dividing line for American foreign policy, and I would argue for American domestic policy too, is not the line between liberal and conservative, not the line between left and right, not the line between Republican and Democrat. The dividing line for American foreign policy and domestic policy is the line between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that matters, or should matter, is which side of the line do you want America to be on? The smart side or the dumb side? If you want it to be on the smart side, I would offer 2 or 3 practical pieces of advice. People always ask me, what can I do? Well, here's what you can do. Number 1, don't get your news from a pre-validated channel which simply confirms all of your existing prejudices. That is illogical. It is irrational. It makes no sense. And it makes impossible assembling the jigsaw puzzle about what it all means. My brother only listens to Fox, my mother-in-law only to MSNBC. Before I started working for CNN, and I'm under contract to them, if there was breaking news on the Middle East, I could appear on all 3 networks during the same day. And the reality is, in order to understand, or even to begin to understand, you've got to stretch beyond your comfort zone. Number 2, civility, which is a much misunderstood concept in American politics. Yes, it's about politeness and courteousness. That's not really what it means. Civility is the capacity to listen to someone with whom you profoundly disagree. And instead of thinking about what your rebuttal points are while he or she is speaking, it's to actually listen in a way that might actually, at the end of the conversation, A, provide ammunition for your argument, or B, better yet, provide a way forward for both of you. And finally, history. At a time when we should know so much about our own history, at a time that we should understand that the world did not begin yesterday, at a time when you have, again, the facility and the capacity, with the aid of a computer, to access an incredible amount of narrative, we are probably the most ahistorical people. Even though books on the Civil War are incredibly popular still, HBO documentaries about the founders, we still somehow ignore the past. And I do not believe history repeats. I'm with Mark Twain on this. History, he said, rhymes. It's the rhythmic patterns of the past that are worth paying attention to, not the strict repetitions. So we invade Iraq in March of 2003. I left government in January. I saw all the intelligence on what we thought Saddam had in terms of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. We invade Iraq with insufficient forces, a woeful misunderstanding of the nature of Iraqi politics, and a vision of Iraq, an American vision of Iraq, not a vision that the Iraqi people would have held, because they were much more interested in getting even rather than in building a new future. And we wonder why we are still involved in one of the two longest wars in American history, with casualty figures, even with a voluntary military that, in my judgment, are unacceptable. We occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, 7 years. Do you know how many Americans were killed during the occupation of Japan on the Japanese mainland during those 7 years? None. Not one. So when I say that history rhymes, it's the rhythmic patterns that we need to pay attention to. When you invade a country like Iraq with insufficient forces and a woeful misunderstanding of the past and of the nature of Iraqi politics, what do you expect is going to happen? And when you want to see the world the way you want it to be rather than the way it is, there's trouble. Number two, I'm not a religious person, although I was raised in a very conservative Jewish household with Hebrew school 5 out of 7 days and a command of Hebrew and biblical texts and all the rest. I'm not a religious person, but I have grown to accept the views of a Protestant theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr argued many things, but what he argued most of all was that in life, the best you are likely to do is to acquire proximate solutions to insoluble problems. That's the story of how things change in America. Proximate solutions to insoluble problems. And I would bet, I'm not a rabbinic scholar, so I can't comment on the origins of the notion of tikkun olam, the repair of the world, but I would bet you that the rabbis, in their infinite wisdom, never envisioned that the world could be fixed this side of redemption. What they envisioned, I suspect, is that the process of repairing the world is the ennobling feature of why you should want to change matters. And I look at America and I think to myself, we demand comprehensive solutions and answers for problems that we continue to try to resolve. We have the war on drugs. We have the war on poverty. We have the war on mental illness. We have the war on crime. We haven't won any of these wars. Niebuhr was right. If you could get proximate solutions to insoluble problems, you'd be way ahead of the game in this country, And certainly that pertains to our foreign policy. One final point, and that's this. Part of the problem with our view of foreign policy is that we, I think, don't understand the nature of the way the world really is. I'm from a real estate family where location, location, location is a preeminent doctrine, and it's understandable. Why? And I would submit to you, if you want to understand American foreign policy, then you must understand as the point of departure, as your point of departure, location, location, location. Where are we? We occupy a position unparalleled, unrivaled, unprecedented in history. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, the Canadians and the Mexicans. Non-predatory neighbors. They don't threaten us, they don't prey on us, they don't pose an existential threat to the existence and coherence of this polity. And we have fish toward east and west, what one historian brilliantly identified as our liquid assets. These liquid assets, these two oceans, and the fact that we are not threatened by our neighbors, means that we have freed ourselves to an extent that any nation in the world ever could from the forces of history and the forces of geography. There is not a nation in the world with which we deal, and we'll touch on some of this, whether it's Israel, China, Putin's Russia, the Palestinians, Egypt, Iran. You can go down the line, and what you will find is that none of them can liberate themselves from the forces of history and geography. They are all hostages to that. We, however, have this extraordinary luxury of physical detachment and incredible security. And it leads, I would never trade it for the world. It makes us and has helped us create the extraordinary nation that we have created here, with a political system, with a political system unique in the annals of history. We are probably the only nation founded on an idea, the only one. I would argue that idea is that individuals actually count. They actually count. But that physical detachment also leads to an idealism, because we somehow believe that what we know is worth sharing with the rest of the world, and what we've done is somehow worth exporting. Second, it leads to an arrogance, because we don't have to listen. Our margin for error is huge. It's beyond the margin of any other power with which we deal with. And it leads to a certain practicality and pragmatism, that we somehow believe we can fix the world's problems. All of these, with the exception of the arrogance, are worth keeping as long as we understand the limitations of our power. I'm not a declinist. This country will have the best balance of economic, military, political, and soft power for the foreseeable future, unrivaled by any nation, including a China that is not rising, a China that has already risen. But within that exceptionalism, we have to accept the fact that we cannot preach, we cannot export the very factors that have made us the way we are, because they are unique to us. And there's nothing wrong, I've argued with John McCain about this repeatedly, about equating our values with our interests. That's what John McCain believes. Our values are our interests, and he's right. But we also have to understand and accept certain realities. In the face of mass killing and humanitarian catastrophes over the course of the last 70 years, this country has failed to intercede and intervene to stop the vast majority of that killing. From the Nazi Holocaust to Cambodia to Rwanda to Darfur to Congo to Syria, with Bosnia and maybe Kosovo as the exceptions. Never again is not the norm of American behavior. That's a hard fact to internalize. But it is true. I sat on the Holocaust Memorial Board and the Executive Committee. And I'm as committed as keeping the memory and the Committee of Conscience alive as anyone. But I also accept the realities. Why haven't we interceded? That is a subject for another presentation. But it's undeniable. So reconciling our values and our interests is not so easy. And we have to be extremely careful now, because of our divisions at home, that we don't overreach, that we understand how means and ends fit together in our foreign policy, because it is a cruel and unforgiving world. Last point. The most compelling ideology I found while traveling the negotiator's highway is not nationalism, not democracy, not capitalism, certainly not communism, not even Islamic extremism. The most compelling ideology in the human enterprise is success. Because success generates power, it generates respect, it generates constituencies, and failure generates the opposite. We have been failing in war making and peacemaking for decades now. The last serious foreign policy we had in this country, and take this as an editorial comment because that's what it is. It's not an objective observation. It's my read on how to evaluate various administrations, was Bush 41, where means and ends fit together, where there was no overreach, when America was admired, feared, and respected. We have not been admired, feared, and respected in the world, in large part because of our own self-inflicted wounds and the nature of the world's problems, which are beyond America's capacity to somehow magically solve since then. So I'll echo Elie Wiesel's words again. Without hope, there is no life. I'm not asking, and nor am I arguing that I've given up hope. But what I have given up are my illusions, because they can be very dangerous, particularly when it comes to projecting American military power abroad. So, Rabbi, with that, I know I've gone on longer than I intended, and I apologize for that. But we can talk about anything you want.
Fantastic. So I do have a series of questions to walk through this evening, topics that we've sort of talked about a little bit. But in addition, I believe there were note cards on the way in. So if people do have questions that you would like to ask, you can hand them around. They'll come up here, and we'll make sure to weave them into the conversation. We definitely want this to be back and forth with whoever's here. So I actually first met Aaron about 2.5 years ago at a rabbinic conference in Philadelphia. You were there talking about Israel and the peace process and prospects for change in that regard. And I think that a lot of us, certainly all of us who are not engaged directly in diplomacy, it's very easy for us to want to imagine stunning changes and earth-shattering results and big headlines. Right? That's what we want. That's what we imagine can happen. If just we find the right formula, things can really change quickly. But you helped us understand, and I got to know sort of your approach. You just gave us a bit of your background, but your approach, when you told us this, you said, what is possible is not transformational, but transactional. What is possible is not transformational, but transactional, which to me is just a realist talking, someone who's actually been doing this work. So again, to help us understand your approach in the years you've done this, based on your personal experiences, why would you say that foreign policy, the approach to foreign policy in the trenches is so different than what we might imagine from being part of the headlines?
First of all, transformation is like greatness in the presidency, is rare. It's transformative, doesn't happen very often. We've had 3 undeniably great presidents in 300 years. 1 a century. I'll let you figure out who's our great president in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
I'm sure it's Woodrow Wilson.
Right. No, it's not Woodrow Wilson. So transformation like greatness in the human enterprise is rare, first of all. And transformation suggests a unique confluence between human agency and circumstance. Marx, not Groucho Marx, but Karl Marx, said that, and he was writing in the 19th century, so forgive me. He said, men make history, but rarely as they please. Marx was right. Individuals can, in fact, shape the course of human events. 6 men between the years 1920 and 1950. 6. I got that right? 6 were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, and prospects of peace and prosperity for most of the Western world. 6 individuals. So don't let anyone ever tell you that leaders don't count, both for good and ill. But leaders are not masters, as Emerson once wrote, of all they survey. They are prisoners to a certain degree, like all of us, of the circumstances in which they live. So transformation requires a moment in which you have leadership and circumstances that combine. And those moments are very rare. We saw, over the course of the last 50 plus years, 3 breakthroughs in the Arab-Israeli peace process. Only 3. You saw Kissinger's disengagement agreements in the wake of the 1973 war and Sadat's decision to break the psychological and political barriers of hostility by offering Menachem Begin, who was able to respond because he had the authority and legitimacy to do so, to trade Sinai for an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. You had the Oslo process between Israelis and Palestinians, which ended in failure as a consequence of Rabin and Arafat's decision to take advantage of a certain moment in time. And as part of Oslo, or at least set into motion by Oslo, you had King Hussein's decision to become the second Arab head of state to make peace with Israel. That's the sum total. I count my old boss's Madrid Peace Conference, which we helped him put together in October 1991. But even Jim Baker realized that that was more process than substance. But the reality in each of these 3 breakthroughs, the United States learned about this after the fact. When Moshe Dayan showed up in Washington in October 1977, I had just joined the State Department and informed those who were working on the negotiations at the time that he had been meeting secretly with Sadat's presidential advisor. People were stunned. I was on leave in Florida in August of 1993 when the State Department Operations Center called to tell me I better get back to Washington because Secretary Christopher was on his way out to California to meet Foreign Minister Perez and Norwegian Foreign Minister Holst because the Israelis and the Palestinians wanted to sign an agreement of principles on the White House lawn the next month. And the Israelis and Jordanians negotiated secretly even before the State of Israel was created. They had established a relationship, even in the pre-state period. All of these breakthroughs occurred without the knowledge of the United States. There's this wonderful notion that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. It's a profound piece of philosophy. Truly, it's profound. Because you don't wash rental cars. I'll use this line all the time, and 3 weeks after I speak, I will get a letter in the mail, usually from a spouse or a girlfriend, who enclosed a little note and a receipt from the car wash with a note that says, "You're wrong, my husband washed the rental car." Okay, fine. But most of us don't wash rental cars because we care only about what we own. And my point to you is, that is why these breakthroughs are possible. Because the locals, as I affectionately describe them, for any number of reasons, understand why it is in their interest to do this. So they go ahead and they start the process. They reach out to one another without our knowledge. It's authentic, it's legitimate, and it's actually sustainable because it's not a phony or an artificial process foisted upon them by the French, the UN Security Council, or the Americans. That's why these breakthroughs, at least two of the three, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, endured. And without that ownership, you cannot have transformation. And I know it's going to come as a shocker to some of you, but we do not have the kind of leaders that are necessary either on the Israeli or the Palestinian side to make the kinds of incredibly, excruciatingly painful choices that will be required if Israelis and Palestinians are going to find themselves into a peace process that actually is worthy of its name. And there are many reasons for that. I don't sit here in judgment. This is not a morality play. People like to turn the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into a morality play. It's not. It's not a conflict between the forces of good and the forces of evil. It's a complicated enterprise. It's the true definition of a tragedy. Both sides have legitimate motives, reasons, and interests. But to make the decisions, it's just too tough. So, do I think we can reach a conflict-ending agreement? And my words are very important to me, and I choose them very carefully. Can we reach a conflict-ending agreement with Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, where Benjamin Netanyahu would stand before the Israeli Knesset and Mahmoud Abbas stand before the Palestinian Legislative Council and say the following? On the 6 core issues that drive our conflict, borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jews, and ending all claims and conflict, can I say to you with a straight face that Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas will stand before their respective peoples and resolve these 6 core issues, including the issue of Jerusalem, which is torturously painful and unbelievably resonant to both sides, and say to one another the conflict is over, no more claims to be adjudicated, no more irredenta to be pursued? No. No honest man or woman would ever want to persuade you of that. That doesn't mean nothing can be done, but if you want heroic diplomacy and transformative diplomacy, you need leaders who have authenticity, legitimacy, power, and understand what needs to be done to reach such an accord. At Camp David in July of 2000, we negotiated in some of the same cabins that Sadat and Begin met in. And I often wondered, they only met 3 times during the summit. Jimmy Carter, a guy who, since he did this extraordinary thing of brokering this agreement, has wandered off the highway, in my judgment, on many different issues and lost. I interviewed Carter for both of my 2 recent books, and it's stunning the degree to which Camp David, yes, was a result of Begin and Sadat's strength and power and legitimacy, but you talk to the Israelis and Egyptians, they will tell you that without Carter there would have been no Camp David, but Carter has lost a certain sensibility that allowed him to broker that accord since leaving the presidency. But I wondered, as I watched Barak and Arafat, and they only met 3 times too during the course of a 12-day summit, and wondered what Arafat was thinking. Well, Arafat actually explained to us on several occasions what he was thinking. And he would say, I heard him say 5 times during a 12-day summit, "You will not walk behind my coffin," which essentially meant if you think that I'm going to sign off on something that will get me killed, you're not thinking clearly. And I thought about Sadat. I also thought about Barak, who must have had Rabin's memory on his mind. Barak actually was quite heroic at Camp David. He went further than any Israeli prime minister has ever gone. Not far enough, given what he wanted to achieve. But, so you need leaders who are prepared to own this and we don't have them.
So you explained a lot about leaders and their capacity. And you talked about the 6 leaders who impacted the world greatly during those decades. But I think this is an apropos question that came from someone here, given your background. Right? You were involved directly in this with a group of people. So the question is, what are your thoughts about the causes and likely impacts about the cutbacks and failure to appoint senior and experienced U.S. diplomats? In other words, there's the leaders on top, but what about the big middle of the people who are getting the work done?
And let me just, before I answer this question, let me say again, I voted for Republicans and Democrats. I've worked for Republicans and Democrats. This republic is very important to me. I spent 25 years of my life trying to advance its interests. I respect its institutions and have watched a series of presidents come and go. And I will say to you that this question about the State Department is just the tip of the iceberg here. I worked for 6 secretaries of state, George Shultz through Colin Powell. Each of them had a different relationship with the president. A successful Secretary of State needs 2 things. I don't care how smart he is or her. I don't care what a brilliant negotiator he or she is. Unless you have these 2 things, you're done. You might as well hang a close for the season sign on the State Department. Number 1, the President of the United States empowers the Secretary of State as the sole repository of authority for carrying out his foreign policy. That does not mean he surrenders decision-making to the Secretary of State. It means that on issues dealing with foreign policy, it is the Secretary of State of the United States of America who speaks for the President. Because it takes our allies and our adversaries 5 minutes to figure out whether or not the Secretary of State of the United States of America is to be taken seriously or not. If the President doesn't empower the Secretary, then the Secretary cannot maneuver at home in the shark-infested waters of Washington, and he cannot maneuver abroad. Now, each of the 6 secretaries I worked for had a different relationship with their president. The one who had the closest relationship was Jim Baker, who was Bush 41's friend. Baker was a Democrat. Bush made him a Republican. Bush helped Baker through the death of his first wife. And I watched on at least one occasion Baker talk to Bush on the phone in a way no Secretary of State would ever talk to a president. They were that close. When I interviewed Bush 41 for one of my books, I said, "Why'd you choose Baker as your Secretary of State?" He said, "I'm not a golfer." So I had to do a little research. He said it was a gimme. I'm assuming, I learned later, that a gimme is when you're this far from the hole. Jim, maybe you can, maybe there are other terms for that. It was a no-brainer as far as Bush 41 was concerned. So each of these Secretaries of State didn't have that kind of relationship, but their presidents at least went through the motions of empowering and didn't create a bureaucratic environment in which you want to talk about foreign policy? Sure. Nikki Haley can stand up and say anything she wants. She can go give a speech at the American Enterprise Institute on Iran, a policy speech, which should be given by the Secretary of State. Jared Kushner, who I met for the first time several months ago, it wasn't a substantive meeting. Nobody has called me to seek my views on what they should do about Arab-Israeli peacemaking, which is fine. But I said to Jared, I wish my father-in-law had as much confidence in me as your father-in-law appears to have in you, because he's given you mission impossible. So we laughed, he laughed. Seems like a nice, reminded me of one of my relatives. He's in the real estate business, he's a nice young man, nice Jewish boy. He's a Hamish, that's how he appeared to me. So the bureaucratic environment that Donald Trump has created for the management and execution of American foreign policy, particularly for poor Mr. Tillerson, who I feel badly for. He's played a bad hand very badly. Don't I mean, let's be clear about that. But he has limits to what he can do. Now he's severely limited. So if the president contradicts the Secretary of State publicly, if Rex Tillerson is in Asia and he says we have at least several channels going with the North Koreans, and the president tweets, Rex, don't waste your time, I mean, my head is going to explode, A, because I've never seen anything like this, and B, someone said to me, well, isn't it good that the president is unpredictable? And the answer is, it is good if the strategy is predictable. And the unpredictability is a device that is used to promote an effective functional strategy. But that is not the case. And again, now it's Groucho Marx dressed as Harpo in Duck Soup. Who are you going to believe, Groucho said, me or your lying eyes? I see this. You see it. I'm not trying to persuade you to be the opposite of what you are. That's not my point. I'm just trying to get you to understand that if you want an effective, functional foreign policy, then you have to be serious about it. You need impulse control. You need discipline. You need to empower your Secretary of State. You don't need to cut the State Department budget by 30%. And you don't undermine your Secretary of State when he's out on the road. Who would take Rex Tillerson seriously? So that's the problem. The other piece of it, you know, and seriously, my comments are not meant to mock or to trivialize or to disrespect anybody here who has exercised their own judgment and their own determination to vote for the candidate they wanted to vote for. That's not the point. But 10 months in, this is the environment in which we are now functioning. And it's important that we just take a look at it. The other piece of it is, will the world cooperate? Secretary of State could have the backing and endorsement of the president, but if there aren't problems out there that lend themselves to resolution, it's going to be hard. And I cannot identify a single problem in the world today. Not one. Not North Korea, not the Israeli-Palestinian issue, not how to manage Vladimir Putin, what to do about jihadi terrorism, which will continue to be a feature of our lives for years to come, what to do about the future of Syria. There's not a single problem out there, in my judgment, that is conducive to transformative diplomacy. What we can do, so I urge you to don't look at the world in terms of solving problems and comprehensive solutions. Look at the world in terms of outcomes that we could help shape that protect our interests. That's the way I think you should look at things. Transactionally, not transformationally. Maybe in a galaxy far, far away, but not back here on planet Earth. It's a cruel and unforgiving world, and in the Middle East, we are stuck there in a region we can't transform and we can't leave. And if you can't transform it and you can't leave it, then you only have one course to follow. And that is what I call transaction. You identify what your core interests are, and we have 3 or 4 of them, and you bear down on them, and you don't get distracted by discretionary enterprises. That is an intriguing feature of this administration, and I think one that I would wholeheartedly agree with, which is an aversion to somehow trying to restructure these societies, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. We can't fix this. Michael Jackson comes to mind, his song, Man in the Mirror. And you know what he said? Or sang? I won't sing it for you. He said, if you want to make a change in your life, you know where you start? Yeah. You look in the mirror. And the Middle East needs a big, long look in the mirror, because we cannot fix what ails them. I pointed out at dinner to somebody that since 1950, Only 22 countries in the world have maintained their democratic character continuously. That's it. It's a very small club. You want to be a democracy? Then you have to prove it over time. I quoted Ben Franklin's apocryphal remark to a woman after he came out of the Constitutional Convention. She asked, "So, Mr. Franklin, what did you produce?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Time is the ultimate arbiter of what is of value in life, whether it's a good marriage, good music, good wine, good business, good diplomacy. Time tells the quality of things. And it's true for democratic states as well. It's a long road for this region. It is a broken region. It is an angry region. It is a dysfunctional region. And it is a region that will remain this way for many years to come. And we need to be extremely careful about understanding what our core interests are in this region and addressing those without getting distracted. But we're now in the 17th year, we're engaged in the two longest wars in American history right now, Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars are being fought by 0.5% of a country of 320 million people. That's a subject for a whole nother conversation. When my father went to war in the Pacific in 1941, there were 130 million people in this country. 16 million of them put on a uniform. 16 million. There was a sense of national obligation. There was a sense of national service. There was a sense of sacrifice. There was a sense that America represented something more than just your own tiny little bubble. And the problem today is that we haven't found a way to turn the M in me upside down so it represents a W in we. If you ask me what the single greatest problem facing this country is in terms of our national ethos, that's it. And I'm not arguing for a return of the draft. There are many professional military planners who argue that's not what you need in an era in which war has become so specialized. But you also can't have a country in which there's no sense of national obligation or responsibility. My daughter came to me. She's 37 now. She came to me at 21 and said, "Explain something to me." I said, "What, Jenny?" She said, "Your parents had the Great Depression and World War II. You and Mom had the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, and Watergate." And then she turned to me and said, what does my generation have? Where are the circumstances that impel me to identify as part of a specific country? And it's not that combating malaria and world hunger and AIDS and pushing for climate change are wrong-headed causes. Judaism has always struggled with this tension between the particularist and the universal. But it seems to me that in a country where we live, there's got to be some identification with its history, its culture, and some sense of service to its broader purposes. And I don't know how, in 2017, I can tell you, based on the political ethos and environment now, we're running in the opposite direction. The military is the most respected institution in the country right now. And it's a volunteer military, which poses some real contradictions. Sorry, I got off the track, but I apologize.
So your track a minute ago was talking about Secretary of State and his relationship and how he does his job. And you, again, spent all your time trying to project American power for some force for good in the world, right? That's sort of the project. So just before we go over to the Middle East, broadening it a little bit, I believe recently our National Security Advisor, McMaster, said something to the effect of this administration has restored strategic competence to our foreign policy.
Quote, I thought a lot about this. Quote, helped restore strategic competence to American foreign policy.
So if that's the goal, would you agree? Is that the direction that we're headed?
Well, we're 10 months in. And again, I feel obligated. Why I should, I don't know, but I do. Because the easiest thing to do, my kids, I'll be even more honest than I have been. My kids want me to go to war. That's their view. You don't get it, Dad. Everything you've worked for in your entire career is in the process of being compromised. Forget the Wilson Center. You got to go to war. You got to go out there and you got to take a position. You have to join the resistance. I've got two of my brother's sons are working in the Trump administration in very senior positions. One is the chief of staff to Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin. They want me to call out my brothers. Call them out. Tell them their kids are doing bad. Jewish people don't do this sort of thing. These are my kids, all right? Well, it's created a certain measure of tension. I love my kids, but I'm not calling out my brothers. And my point to my kids is people stop listening, all right? Country's divided. If I can make any contribution at all, it's because I maybe can keep those who have every reason to doubt what I say and to question it, maybe I can get them to actually listen to what I'm saying. I can't do that if they shut down immediately because I'm viewed as some sort of partisan warrior. I can't do that. I mean, it's against my nature, first of all. R's and D's. So I'm not sure exactly how. So when I say to you, before I answer the rabbi's question, I voted for R's and D's, I work for R's and D's, it's important to me to reinforce that sensibility. Has this administration helped restore strategic competence to American foreign policy? Well, we're 10 months in. I asked one of my colleagues today to identify the most significant foreign policy accomplishment of this administration in 10 months. And I know that, by the way, that it's very difficult. We live in a cruel and unforgiving world. These problems can't be resolved, but we are both hard-pressed to come up with a discrete answer to that question. That's not the issue. The issue is not the headline. The issue is the trend line. And I would argue to you that the administration's position on most of the issues of the day are neither strategic nor terribly competent. That's an analytical judgment based on working for half a dozen secretaries of state and getting to know at least two presidents. And it could change. I mean, you're only 10 months in. Other administrations, other presidents have taken a while to accommodate and accustom themselves to the problems of governance. And most of our presidents, there's no school for presidents. They're all blind dates. Even the ones whose resumes we think we know. They're blind dates. Because no matter how competent you are, you ascend to that job, everything changes. Your responsibilities, your power, all of that is invested in you. I told the story, I was on CNN the other day. They asked me about how the president processes information. I told them a story. It's 1982. The Israelis have just invaded Lebanon. I'm at the State Department. I'm the INR, Bureau of Intelligence and Research, analyst covering Lebanon. I'm charged to brief the Secretary of State and to provide written analysis 2 or 3 times a day to keep the Secretary informed. I'm sitting at my desk one morning, and the phone rings. And it's the White House sit room calling. Not the Secretary, the White House sit room. So the voice on the other end says, hold. So I'm holding. And all of a sudden, the next voice I hear says the following to me. Aaron, yes, this is Vice President George H.W. Bush calling. I said, Mr. Vice President, it's an honor. He said, listen, I know you're busy. And I don't want to take too much of your time, but I read a memo that you wrote the other day on Lebanon. Do you have time to talk about it? I said, sure. So we talked for 20 minutes. I hung up the phone, and I thought to myself, Mr. Vice President of the United States, he's obviously not getting the information that he wants from CIA briefers or the President's daily brief, which is what they provide every day. So he's reaching out. Kennedy used to call the Vietnam analyst at the State Department directly when he had a question. But I thought to myself, here's a guy, ambassador to China, director of the CIA. I mean, he's a foreign policy wonk, but he knows what he doesn't know. And he was in a hurry to find out. You see, that kind of curiosity, and that's what it is. It's curiosity in the service of the national interest. I don't care how many smart advisors you have around you. Whether you listen to them or not, ultimately, you are the one who has to make the decision. You have to make it. So I worry about that. I really do. It's an objective read based on a story that is 30 plus years old, but it still rings true today. And I think presidents need to have that sense of judgment, sense of prudence. The 3 greatest presidents also had an extraordinary capacity to keep their interior space closed. Lincoln, his law department described him as the most shut-mouthed man he'd ever met. And Lincoln wrestled with a degree of death and destruction that no other president in our history has wrestled with. He lost 2 kids during the service of his presidency. His wife ultimately spent her final years in a mental institution, was emotionally distraught and extremely difficult to handle. And the clinical psychologists diagnosing Lincoln from his behavior and his letters years after are convinced he was manic depressive. Who knows? But Lincoln managed to keep his personal demons under control. His interior space was closed. Washington in the 18th century was the same way, and FDR, even though he craved the attention of others. And in the case of Lucy Mercer Rutherford, did not keep his impulses under control. Also kept his interior space closed. That kind of impulse control for a president is really important. Really important. And I say this not to condemn or to preach. I say this because I think it really does matter when you talk about how to create effective governance and leadership, particularly in a social media age where the tendency and the temptation to speak out, to tweet out, to talk amplifies your message in a way that was never possible before. So that's critically important, I think, as we go forward.
Shifting more over to the Middle East, probably the biggest story that's been going on recently is what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Could you maybe explain to us?
And I'll try to do it briefly so we can have more questions.
And just as importantly, how it impacts America and if it impacts Israel.
Right. People ask me for years, what's new in the Middle East, and usually the answer is nothing. Now it's 2 words, Saudi Arabia. This is a potentially transforming event. In this region, you rarely have leaders that are risk ready. You have leaders who are constrained by their own political difficulties and by regional constraints. I could count on one hand the number of leaders who have done things that are extraordinarily dramatic and transformative. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. That was idiosyncratic. Arab leaders don't do that. Saddam did. Anwar Sadat to Jerusalem, potentially transformative. King Hussein's peace treaty with Israel, transformative. What Mohammed bin Salman, the 32-year-old son, youngest son of King Salman of Saudi Arabia, is doing is remarkable, both by Middle East standards and by Saudi standards. The Saudi system is designed to function according to consensus. You manage the royals and you maintain continuity by not doing things publicly and by distributing power among various factions of the family, not centralizing it. And what this guy has done in the last several weeks, particularly last weekend, is that he has, under the guise of corruption, of anti-corruption, and it is not the central reason why he's done this, he's used anti-corruption. I mean, after all, he bought a $500 million yacht. Who paid for that? Where are the receipts for that yacht? Where did it come from? Nobody in the kingdom has clean hands. And if they ever try these people, imprisoned for the moment at the Ritz, which is the lighter aspect of the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, which is the light, this is Game of Thrones without the blood and gore, is what it is. Under the guise of an anti-corruption pretext, he has systematically begun to eliminate potential sources of opposition. The most significant thing about last weekend was his removal of Prince Mitab, who is the son of the late King Abdullah, from his control of the Saudi National Guard. 100,000-man force which is charged with protecting the royal family. There are three elements of the Saudi military. There's the National Guard, there's the Saudi land forces, and then there's the Ministry of Interior that controls the intelligence organizations. Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's called, MBS, now has control of all three. He's gone after the media conglomerates. He has now confiscated the assets they estimate of up to $800 billion under the guise of anti-corruption. And his arrest of Prince al-Walid bin Talal, reportedly the richest man in the world, who is the poster child for a modernized, globalized Saudi economy, is representative of just how far he's prepared to go in ensuring there is nobody bigger and more independent than he is. Now, that centralization of power, if it leads to reform, will not only be tolerated by the Saudi public, particularly by young people in the middle class, he'll be hailed. If the reforms for more open political expression, women are not only driving, but they're allowed to drive by themselves, not in the presence and company of a male relative, which is still the case. If he goes after the hardline clerics who have been exporting a intolerant, extremist form of Wahhabist Islam abroad, if he reforms the economy and diversifies and weans Saudi Arabia off of hydrocarbons, then maybe. But if all of this was simply an effort for him to become the Putin in the Persian Gulf, he's taken on an enormous amount. Where it affects the Israelis and us is not so much at home, but abroad. And his record so far in foreign policy does not inspire. He was the one who ramped up support for the Saudi war in Yemen, which is now ongoing. Yes, the Houthis, a Zaidi sect in Yemen, a failed or failing state, backed by Iran, absolutely, have challenged the centrality of the Yemeni government. which the Saudis are supporting. But Saudi airstrikes have killed thousands. And Saudi blockades and boycotts have prevented the delivery of humanitarian aid. You know Yemen has a cholera epidemic as well as massive famine. Qatar, he's picked a fight with the emir, and it's now 3 or 4 months old. That policy is not working. And just over the last several days, he clearly forced the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, to resign in an effort to strip away, rightly, the cover that Lebanon is somehow governed by a confessionally balanced elite. Lebanon is dominated by Hezbollah and Iran. And today, he's called on all Saudis to leave Lebanon. And the Bahrainis and Kuwaitis have followed. All of this ramps up the tension and creates a set of circumstances that could easily trip into tensions between the Israelis and Hezbollah along the border. I don't predict it. I think it's unlikely. There are practical matters here. I don't think the Israelis want to open the Hezbollah box right now. I think it's a fraught problem for them. They don't have an answer to the more than 100,000 high trajectory weapons that can now blanket Israel, not just from Haifa to the Lebanese border, but as far south as Beersheba. And I don't think Hezbollah, bogged down in Syria, fighting Iran's war to support Bashar al-Assad, wants to tangle either. Also, weather is a problem. If you look at when the Israelis have launched their campaigns in 78, 82, 93, 96, and 2006, it's always been in the period April through July, because weather is a factor in constraining Israeli air operations. And this time of year, for any of you who have spent any time in the Middle East and even in Israel, the weather can be nasty. So that does not bode well. We, for reasons that are unclear, have abandoned any pretense of objectivity when it comes to Saudi Arabia and have essentially endorsed MBS wholeheartedly. To me, that's an unwise move. The Saudis are not our allies. They are at best security partners. And I will say to you flat out, there's only one country in the Middle East in which there is a coincidence and correlation between American interests and American values. And that correlation, by the way, of interest between the United States and Israel does not occur across the board. Any of you looking for a relationship between the U.S. and Israel in which every aspect of Israeli policy is going to coincide with, in agreement, in a harmonious way, with every aspect of American policy, aren't thinking clearly. For one simple reason, because where you stand in life has everything to do with where you sit. And Israel and Washington and Jerusalem are sitting on different planets. We have non-predatory neighbors and fish to our east and west. The Israelis are sitting on top of a volcano. I've had 2 Israeli prime ministers, Benjamin Netanyahu and the late Yitzhak Rabin, say the exact same thing to me in personal conversation. Quote, "Do not preach to us about our security. You live, both of them said this, you live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. We're sitting in a very dangerous environment." I respect that. I understand it. It leads to a situation in which the U.S. and Israel, in terms of a coincidence of their interests, simply cannot coincide across the board. I've long ago, we're off the point here, but it's an important point to make. I long ago abandoned the notion that the United States is just waiting to sacrifice Israel on the altar of expediency and American interests. Anyone looking at the U.S.-Israeli relationship over the course of the last 62 years should understand that what is so remarkable about this relationship is not where it diverges, but where it coincides. And I call it the cosmic oy vey, which is the syndrome in the Jewish community to worry too much about the U.S. and Israel. That is not what you should worry about when it comes to Israel. You should worry about Israel's security problems. You should worry about the contradictions and anomalies that exist within Israeli society, even for a modernizing, resilient, extraordinary state, which is going to endure. That's what's worth worrying about. But the only state in which values and interests coincide in the entire region are the Israelis. And Israel is not a perfect democracy. Let's be clear. But there's a high correlation between our values, humanistic, pluralistic, democratic polity with a free press, and a modern sensibility with freedom of conscience, which is rarely discussed, but is critically important. The capacity to get up and say what you want within reason without fear of bodily harm or injury. I could go to Times Square, get on a shuttle, when I get back to Washington, go up to Times Square, stand in the middle of the street and say a lot of things that are on my mind without fear that anybody is going to hurt me, let alone kill me. I can do the same thing in Dizengoff. I cannot do the same thing in Cairo. I cannot do it in Damascus. I cannot do it in Riyadh. If I am a Saudi, Syrian, or Egyptian citizen, I do not have freedom of conscience. Those societies don't permit it. You mock Islam, you can be killed for it. So I guess my point is, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, they don't share our values. And we have, in my judgment, given them too many blank checks, both with respect to exporting the Wahhabist extremist ideology that they continue to do, pay for mosques, imams, and madrasas from Pakistan to tiny Kosovo, to Indonesia, which radicalizes their Muslim communities there. And I think MBS, the 32-year-old, is overly ambitious. And I think abroad, he's getting Saudi Arabia involved in complex issues and in the process dragging us with him. I think we need a little more distance, frankly, in our relationship with the Saudis. That's the big problem.
So we may not share values with the Saudis, but it appears that MBS, this young leader, is consolidating power and doing so for a reason, to try to reestablish more hegemony in that region, right, that Saudi Arabia may have lost. So, of course, the other pole, and you use this great term, the cosmic oy vey, I would have thought the cosmic oy vey was Iran, right? That's the other side of the equation.
Right.
So 2.5 years ago, back in the spring of 2015, we were all talking about the deal, right? This arrangement that was being made regardless to Iran. We had lots of robust conversation here at this temple and across the Jewish community. Don't know if anyone remembers talking about Iran a couple years ago. Very big topic, very difficult topic. You addressed the AIPAC conference that spring talking about this issue. And at the time, here's what you said. According to your understanding 2.5 years ago, when this was still being debated, there was not an agreement yet. But in debating this agreement, you said to us at the conference that there were many people in government who believed that the ultimate purpose of the treaty was not to ensure a nuclear-free Iran. It was not to ensure a nuclear-free Iran. Rather, they argued that there will come a day at some point when a simple decision will need to be made. Either bomb Iran or allow Iran to get the bomb. And you said that because of that, this treaty was not to keep them from getting the bomb, but to push that decision back as far as possible.
Right.
To push back the decision of what to do ultimately about Iran.
Right.
So 2.5 years later, with the treaty behind us, do you agree with your assessment, and where are we today with Iran?
I appeared before an AIPAC group in New York shortly before the agreement was reached with Bret Stephens, who's now writing for the New York Times. And AIPAC, I speak at the policy conference every year. AIPAC had prepared a card. I don't know, any of you who are active in AIPAC may remember. On the card, there were 5 things that AIPAC suggested that they get from the administration. And I remember vividly holding the card up to the APAC audience and I said, you see these 5 things on this card? You're not going to get any of them. The agreement's going to pass because a willful, skillful president summoning up American national security interests will trump domestic political interests, even those that are pushing pro-Israeli agendas, every time. That has been my conviction, it's been my experience. The notion that the White House is somehow Israeli-occupied territory, which is not only a stupid thing to say, it borders on the darker aspects of anti-Semitism, which is a view that is universally held in Europe and in the Arab world, and among the left in many instances, that the U.S. Congress is the little Knesset, and that the White House is Israeli-occupied territory. It's insane. It's stupid, it's insane, and again, it borders or is anti-Semitic. The pro-Israeli community in this country is powerful. There's no question about it. But in the face of a president arguing for the American national interest, the president will win and has won on the 4 or 5 occasions when, in fact, there has been conflicts. That's why I said to them that day that the JCPOA, it's not a treaty, it's an agreement. I argue it's an executive agreement, which has now been incorporated in the UN Security Council resolution. My view of the agreement then was that it was flawed, but potentially functional, in that it was designed to do 2 things, and only 2 things. Preempt the need for an Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear facilities and make an American strike unnecessary. That's what it was designed to do. Because it was designed to constrain for a discrete period of time, Iran's capacity to produce enough fissile material, that is to say either through plutonium extraction or enriching uranium, to make 1 nuclear bomb. That's what the so-called breakout means. That Iran, in X number of months, would be able to produce enough fissile material to produce 1 nuclear weapon. Forget delivering the weapon, but to produce enough fissile material to make the weapon. It was not designed to stop Iran's behavior in the region. It was not designed to create a transformation so that the malacracy in Tehran would somehow open up the system. In fact, the Iranians signed this agreement for precisely the opposite reason. To make sure that there was enough economic assistance, enough growth in the Iranian economy that they would not stimulate public unrest that would undermine the mullah's control. It was a transactional agreement. Any of you are a Rolling Stones fan? When Mick Jagger sang, sometimes you might find in life you get what you want, but you don't always get what you need. That's what this was all about. This was getting what you need, not what you want. Now, the Trump administration has wrestled now for months with this issue of what to do about the JCPOA. And best I can tell, they are abiding by the agreement. And unless Congress, by mid-January of next year, passes additional restrictions through legislation that impose additional requirements that will somehow force the Iranians out of the agreement or impose stringent requirements that our partners in Europe can't accept, I suspect the agreement will continue. Flawed but functional. I have no solution to the problem of how to stop Iran should they want a nuclear weapon. And both our intelligence services and the Israelis have come to the conclusion that the mullahs have not yet decided, unlike Kim Jong-un in North Korea, whether or not they should produce a nuclear weapon. In my view, the Iranians have so milked and bilked the international system. Think about what they've done. In exchange for a nuclear weapon they don't even have, nor have they made a decision to develop. They have extracted billions of dollars, both from the Europeans in aid and in trade, without even having a nuclear weapon. It's very smart negotiating. In fact, it may well be in their interest never to have a nuclear weapon, because this way they can get a lot more. I suspect that that is in fact the game, but you can't be sure. So if you're looking for an agreement that will somehow hermetically guard against the possibility that Iran at some point could decide to produce enough fissile material to make a bomb and do it secretly, which would probably take them a year, I can't help you. Because you have four, outside of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who have nuclear weapons. The Russians, the French, the Brits, the Chinese, and us. You have 4 additional powers who have nukes, deliverable nukes. You've got the Indians, you have the Pakistanis, you have the Israelis, and you have the North Koreans. Have we been able to stop any of them? No. If South Korea or Japan wants a nuclear weapon, the Japanese are sitting on enough enriched uranium that would probably take them less than a year to develop it. And the South Koreans as well. And they may well, in response to Kim Jong-un's nukes, ultimately decide that they want them too. So if you're looking for a political agreement that's going to stop the Iranians or an amendment to the current agreement, keep on looking. It's not going to happen. That leaves only one course of action: military. And as one Israeli described it to me, an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear sites is like mowing the grass. Sure, the Israelis operating at maximum capacity at the outer edges of their capabilities could probably set back the Iranian nuclear program a couple years. But what for? So the Iranians now say, you see, we don't even have a nuclear weapon. And the Israelis have struck, or the Americans have struck. Now we want a nuclear weapon. And we're going to build one with the support, legitimate support of the international community, including the Russians and the Chinese, who will be only too happy to isolate the United States and to sell the Iranians everything they need. I don't have a fix for this problem. But I would argue to you that it is in our interest still to buy as much time as possible, to constrain the Iranians for as long as possible. Because Iran with a weapon, given its regional ambitions, which are large, is a lot more dangerous than Iran without a weapon. And I have no illusions. Anyone who believed that Iran would be transformed by this agreement was just, it makes me mad to think that someone could actually believe this. I mean, you have to be interminably obtuse or just willfully malicious to believe such a thing. In fact, I guarantee you what the Supreme Leader thought after this agreement was signed is, we're going to expand our regional role to show the world and the Americans and the Israelis that we have not been domesticated by this agreement with the Americans. You could have expected support for Assad, additional support for the Houthis in the wake of this accord. So I don't live in a galaxy far, far away. I live here on planet Earth. We do not have a solution to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, unless you want to invade the country, occupy it, and put in your own government. And frankly, that's of limited value and utility. The American public wouldn't accept it, Congress wouldn't accept it, the international community wouldn't accept it, and it would be unbelievably stupid. We're 16 years into Afghanistan and Iraq, with 140,000 American forces in Iraq, 100,000 in Afghanistan. Look at what's happening there. I was on a plane 4 or 5 years ago, flying out to California to give a speech. And the sponsors paid for first class, so I was really happy, and I'm sitting on the aisle. And the plane's boarding, we got on first, and I see a guy, his girlfriend, his wife, no legs, military haircut. Maybe he wasn't in the military, I don't know. I suspect he was. They wheel him on in a wheelchair. And he goes into coach. And plane takes off, wheelchair's off the plane. About an hour and a half into the flight, I'm working on the aisle and I look over to my left. And here's what I see. I see this kid dragging himself into the bathroom. And I had a hard time keeping it together because I wondered, and I liked Bush 43. I've had a couple of really good conversations with him, but I do not understand what Iraq was all about. I do not understand why 6,000 Americans plus are now dead as a consequence. Afghanistan was legitimate. We were attacked. Taliban gave al-Qaeda sanctuary. CIA-supported forces, limited numbers, cleared that country by the fall. And then we got ambitious in Iraq. I do not understand what the point of these sacrifices were. I watched Ken Burns' 18 and a half hours on Vietnam. And I thought to myself, when America acts, it has to ask itself 3 questions. Number 1, can we do it? Number 2, should we do it? And number 3, what will it cost? And it took me about an hour to compose myself because I'm not here. It's not a question of trivializing the sacrifices of a volunteer military. These young men and women went, they served, many died, many received life-threatening injuries from which they will never recover. That sacrifice for them was a willful choice. They served honorably and they sacrificed. What I don't understand is the political decisions. And that's why, when it comes now to projecting American military force, and I have to say, after 10 months, I've come to the conclusion this administration is very risk-averse when it comes to the use of military force. It is not risk-ready. I will say this to you. What George W. Bush did in Iraq, for all of you people who don't like Donald Trump, what George Bush did in Iraq and the consequences of that decision was far more destructive to this country's credibility, its young men and women, and its resources than anything Donald Trump has done in 10 months of being president. You could like that statement, you could not like it, but it is true. And that's why we need to think before we act. We need to understand the environments in which we're acting. And we have to ensure that when we act, we do so with as firm an understanding of how means relates to ends and whether the ends are achievable. So, you want to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon? You got 3 choices. You can negotiate the way they've been doing to constrain. You could try to improve the agreement. The Iranians break out of the agreement, walk away from it, and are on their road to producing a nuclear weapon. Yeah, you could try military force. I just think in the end, that's not going to work. And we sit now, I might add, with another nuclear file, which is much more serious and much more potentially devastating, which is open. And that is what to do about the fact that Kim Jong-un, KJU, has deliverable nuclear weapons and is working on an intercontinental ballistic missile, and once they have range, once they master reentry, they'll be able to hit most American cities. Now, would they? It would mean imminent destruction of the regime. But how do you deal with that? There is no military option in North Korea. None. And every military planner knows it. You strike North Korea now, or you try to hit a missile on a launch pad, or as it ascends, and the North Koreans could respond not with nuclear weapons, by using their short-range missiles, which are capable of causing tens of thousands of casualties. Seoul is about as far from Pyongyang or from the DMZ as we are from Detroit. So you got 250,000 Americans in South Korea now. You got 25,000 American forces. You could end up with a catastrophe on the Korean Peninsula. And it's hard to see that happening. And he's not interested in negotiating right now. So what do? I don't know the answer. I'm not sure there is an answer. But you try to manage this as best you can. And you avoid escalation and threats of escalation that could lead to miscommunication, misunderstanding, and a miscalculation. So in short, you don't have many good options with the Iranians. If I were running the railroad, I'd work with the Israelis on contingency plans after these provisions go into sunset, 8 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out, to see what you could do. But if the Iranians want a nuclear weapon, they're going to get one.
So bringing it back to Israel. So you obviously spent a lot of time working on this specific peace process, negotiating, meeting a lot of the actors involved. And I believe you started at the State Department in 1988. Is that right?
Well, it actually started in 78.
78.
But working for
Right.
Secretaries of State, 88.
Right. So working directly for Secretaries of
Right.
State administration in 88. So in your estimation, so you've watched this go through from the Reagan days, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2. You've obviously not working, but watching Obama and Trump today.
Yep.
Would you say we are closer to peace today than we were in 1988 or further?
Well, first of all, that word is, I know how attractive it is in both languages, but it's a problem because you have an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. You have an Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. These are not normal agreements between nations who are at peace. You don't have the rich set of scientific, cultural, people-to-people exchanges. You don't have the kind of environments in which Israelis, Egyptians, and Jordanians are somehow getting to know one another. These are transactional agreements. They're very important. And with the Palestinians, I would argue that the notion of peace is more or less it's going to be more of a transactional business agreement rather than any sort of love fest. It was Franklin who said that proximity breeds contempt in children. And the fact is, the Israelis and Palestinians, you wouldn't need a peace process if they didn't have a proximity problem. But they do. They're living on top of one another. I would say the odds of a conflict ending agreement right now are slim to none. That could change. And I've learned in my 68 years never to say never about things. First of all, we adults occupy a tiny space for a very short period of time. And it's morally unacceptable to say to your kids, this will never happen. I mean, how could I say that? I don't have the right to say it. So, yeah, could there be a serious agreement between Israelis and Palestinians? Sure. You just give me 3 things, and I'll give you a shot. Number 1, give me leaders who are willing to lead. You don't have them. Number 2, give me ownership. That is to say, Israelis and Palestinians who care more about this than we do. And finally, since they will need a third party, give me an administration that actually knows what it's doing. And not just this one. I take full responsibility for mistakes we made during the Clinton administration. And Bill Clinton was beloved by Israelis and Palestinians. I remember at the Palestinian National Council meeting that in Gaza, the president went to show his support, that a couple Palestinian leaders sitting around me turned to me and said, why can't we have a leader like him? They loved him. But, frankly, he got too close to them. To be an effective mediator, you need honey, a lot of honey, to provide reassurance. But let's be clear about something. You need vinegar. You need honey and vinegar. There's no way this is going to get done without serious tensions between the U.S. and Israel and the U.S. and the Palestinian side. No way. Because you need to push for that extra mile, you're going to need to push both sides further than they probably are willing to go. And that results in a lot of broken crockery. But the U.S.-Israeli relationship is big enough to handle that. I think if you ever got a Palestinian leader who was willing and able to make decisions, I think the same would apply. But right now, the answer is no. Mr. Trump and Mr. Kushner and Mr. Greenblatt will announce some sort of initiative, I suspect. What it will be is unclear. I will say one thing about discipline. Never have I seen such radio silence imposed on a peace process in all my years working on this. Either there's something really important that they're protecting, or alternatively, well, ... So I don't know. And I say I wish Mr. Kushner luck, and I really do mean this. I mean, I had my 20 plus years. I'm done fixing the world. I'm now trying to explain it. I wish them enormous success.
So when you were working on it, you worked on Madrid in 92, right, which set the stage for Oslo in 93 and 94. How big a deal was the handshake? How big a deal was the handshake?
On the south lawn of the White House? You know, it's funny because I got a different, Rabin is not a sentimental guy. He never was. He hated small talk. The first time I met him was, my parents were very close to Leah and Yitzhak. And Lindsay and I were in Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And in April of '74, shortly before Rabin would become prime minister, that Passover, Leah invited us to their apartment for dinner. I never met Rabin before. It was the first time. And I'm sitting directly across the table from him, and I'm working on my PhD at the University of Michigan on Middle Eastern history, and here's a guy who, a leader of the Palmach, a seminal figure in Israel's history, and I was going to impress him. And he asked me what I thought about Sadat. And I went through this whole explanation, and Rabin just sat there smoking, chain smoking. And I finished, and he said, and he waved his hand in the way he usually would, when he waved his hands, he would say, "You can forget about it." That's what he would say. But he said, "It's amazing how much you don't know about our region." So I looked at Lindsay. She really looked at me and felt really badly. I was crushed for the remainder of the. So Rabin did not. There was no small talk with him. I think he appreciated Arafat because he understood that Arafat, however disagreeable a character he was, and their body language with one another was really bad. This was not Shimon Peres, who would easily have embraced Arafat and did. I think Rabin respected Arafat during the initial phases of Oslo because he honestly believed that Arafat had made some very difficult decisions. And I think Arafat did make difficult decisions. Arafat, on the other hand, was always inexplicable to me. I got to know him in a way that most people don't, so I saw beneath the cardboard sort of figure. I'll just relate two stories. My mom passed in November of 96, Thanksgiving, at 70. And I'd come back from the negotiations to be with her in the last remaining months of her life. During the Shiva, which was extraordinary, hundreds of people came through. And the Shiva, I finally understood what the purpose of the Shiva is. It's to complete the story. That's what it is. A lot of people came up to me to tell me stories about my mom, which were extraordinary. But during the third or fourth day of the Shiva, my brother said, you have a phone call from Gaza. So I walked in the kitchen at her house, and it was Saab Erekat on the phone, who said, the chairman would like to talk to you. So it was Arafat. It was Arafat saying to me, your mother died, I understand that. I want you to know how sorry I am, and let me express my deep condolences on behalf of the Palestinian people. So I hung up. I mean, when you're grieving, things always seem to be a little different than normal. It took me a couple days to process this, and I realized what had happened. Saab, who was a friend of mine, told Arafat that Aaron's mother had died. It's a smart thing to do, boss. Give him a call. Netanyahu called too, to his credit as well. But I saw a side of Arafat that most people don't see. But the last time I saw him was with Powell in March of 2002. The Israelis had surrounded the Muqata, his headquarters. He was there, windows were blockaded, there were candles on the table, his machine gun there, where the Secretary of State walked in the room, his machine pistol was on the table. And he said to us, you know, I'm willing to die in the defense of Palestine. And Powell said, this is going to be the last time I'm probably going to see you. And I walked away from the meeting thinking that he never really could give up the role and the image of, in Arabic, the word is munadil, the struggler. And that was who he was. Until the end, he never gave up the gun. And Arafat's real transgression was not that he didn't accept what Barak put on the table. I don't think any Palestinian leader could have. Arafat's real transgression was after Sharon's visit to the Haram, Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. He could have put the forces of violence back in the box. But my read on it is he didn't want to. He had told us in June, do not invite me to Camp David because the summit will fail and the Middle East will burn. That's what he said. And I thought to myself, I never forgot that. I think, and Barak blamed him in Clinton's way, took Barak's side and blamed him in September for not being forthcoming in negotiations. I think Arafat loosed. He didn't cause the visit to Haram. He didn't start the violence. But I think he did absolutely nothing to contain it. And he managed to improve his negotiating position by the end of the year as well. But that decision, in my judgment, was his real transgression. And the Israeli-Palestinian situation has not fundamentally recovered from that because you now have a situation, even with this reconciliation agreement between Hamas and Fatah and Gaza, the Palestinian national movement still looks like Noah's Ark. They're two of everything. They're two constitutions, two sets of security services, two statelets, two visions of where Palestine is and where it's supposed to be between Fatah and Hamas. And unless the Palestinian national movement can reacquire a monopoly on the forces of violence within Palestinian society, you can hang a close for the season sign on this entire process. Because if I were an Israeli, the only thing you get out of an agreement with the Palestinians is all of the guns of Palestine fall silent. And if the Palestinians cannot deliver that with a monopoly over the forces of violence, if you want to be a state, I don't care, you want to be a city, you want to be Detroit, you want to be Chevy Chase, you have to control the guns. I mean, you know, we're 4% of the world's population and we have 40%, almost 40% of the world's guns. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about controlling the organized forces of violence within your society. Palestinians haven't done that. And if they can't, there's no way there's going to be a Palestinian state. So, I mean, I think some people argue we're done. Two-state solution is irrelevant. You've got to look for some other solution. I think it's the least bad way to end this conflict, but I think it's the only way to ensure separation. And unless you can separate through negotiation, you're going to continue to wrestle with the same problems. I just think we're a long way away from anything remotely resembling a conflict-ending agreement, let alone peace.
And based on what you just described with not only Arafat, but these different apparatuses and what goes on that side, one of the great debates in the Jewish community has always been, is there anything we can do, or is it all in the other side's hands? In other words, do we have any control really, or are they determining that? So part of my question would be, would anything have been different if Rabin wasn't killed?
You know, my view is if there was a rewind button on history and I could change two things, I think you and I, all of us, would be having a different conversation. Number one, Rabin would not have been murdered. And number two, and this is a partisan political comment, so forgive me, that Bush 41 would not have lost to Bill Clinton in November of '92. And Bush would have remained president and Baker would have continued as Secretary of State, because I think, and Rabin said as much, with Baker, Bush, and Rabin, I think you could have gotten one agreement, not two, either between Israel and Syria. But I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal entitled, this was last year, what if Israel had returned the Golan Heights to Syria? Think about it, in view of what's happened in Syria. I think you would have had one agreement, though, between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and Syria. Because in the end, it's all about leadership. And I think Bush and Baker understood what they needed to do. Rabin definitely understood. And I think with that combination, you might have enticed either Arafat or Assad into an agreement.
So final question for the evening, and then I know you're going to be willing to stick around a little bit if anyone has specific questions. But you've talked about a cruel world. You've told us about the difficulties of foreign policy, whether it's in North Korea, the Middle East, what's happening at home. You've described intractable conflicts. You said, actually, at dinner earlier this evening, you said that your goal isn't to depress us or to
make
say
you happy.
anything negative or to make us happy, right? You're an analyst. You're presenting this. But I have to just one last time try. When we leave here tonight, with what you've explained to us and with your understanding of the last 30 years of America's foreign policy and what's happening in the world today, what can we look forward to? What would you say that we could walk out of here feeling hopeful about on the international arena, specifically in the Middle East?
Well, one thing is American for sure. And I mean, I think this is clearly, whatever Obama's imperfections were, and there were many, and Donald Trump, frankly, has continued the same approach. Fewer Americans are dying in conflicts abroad. That, in essence, if you ask me what the major contribution of the Trump administration is after 10 months, that's it. A sense that there are limits to American power, that we have vital interests, that foreign policy is social work, is not a smart way to work, that you're not going to rebuild these societies, that Americans are going to be resented if they preach, and certainly if we occupy countries. I think that if that trend holds, and the projection of American military force is wise and prudent, then I think that's reason enough to celebrate. I have great faith in America, its capacity for reinvention, for innovation, and for resilience. I mentioned to you that we got through blue and gray. I use this a lot on my kids, they just don't believe it. I said, well, look, we got through blue and gray. It's the greatest challenge any nation faced. Any nation faced. 750,000 Americans died, according to recent historical estimates. The country's put on a new pathway You have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We have a long way to go on race, clearly, in this country. But something critically important has happened here. So we got through blue and gray, I think to myself, why can't we get through blue and red? And the answer is, I think we can. But I think we have to be smart, determined, focused, and dedicated. And I'll repeat what Jack Kennedy said. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. If you walk away with anything from our conversation tonight, I would argue that that's how you should look at the world. Idealism without illusion. Never, ever give up on the prospects that you can be changed for the better, your family. The world can be made a better place. But as you go through the process of your own personal redemption and trying to fix the world, you got to go through it with your eyes wide open, because the costs of not doing that are increasingly fraught and more dangerous.
Well, I hope that everyone feels the way that I do, which is that walk away from this evening with a much greater sense of understanding, not just about what's happening in the world, but how we got there and what happens a little bit behind the scenes. So you shared incredible stories, wisdom, a few laughs even, which we appreciate. And I hope you'll join me in thanking Aaron for being here tonight.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you. Once again, Aaron will be here for a few minutes. He does have an early flight, so I don't want to promise him for a long time. But if anyone has a little follow-up or would like to meet him, please come up. Otherwise, drive home safely. Thank you for coming tonight, everyone.